Joining me today is Yardena Schwartz. Yardena Schwartz is an award-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated producer who worked at NBC News, including stints at The Today Show, Nightly News with Brian Williams, and MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell Reports. Her reporting has appeared in the New York Times, New York Review of Books, Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Time, National Geographic, Rolling Stone, among other publications. She graduated with honors from Columbia Journalism School in 2011 and received an Emmy nomination for her work at MSNBC in 2013. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks so much for having me, Dan.
So you came out with this amazing new book, Ghosts of Holy War, the 1929 massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict. When I was reading your book, I thought of Adir Tahar of Golani, who was killed on October 7th, beheaded, and they actually took his head into Gaza, attempted to sell it online, and due to the amazing activism of his father, this was made, the IDF knew about it, and they actually returned his head for a proper burial. And one might see October 7th and think that it's Israel's occupying forces and it's the Green Line or some political dispute that leads to such a tragedy. But your book provides an insight that maybe we could have gone in a different path. Maybe there could have been, there was a segment of the Palestinian population, of the Arab population, that didn't think like this. Where does the conflict start, based on your research and your insight into what happened in Hebron in 1929?
First off, I want to say that story of Adar is in my book, actually. I remember that story very well, and that they found his head in, I believe, in a convenience store in the ice cream container. Horrific. And it reminds me of how I felt on October 7th, like everyone, shocked that this was happening. But my shock was not so much the barbarism, because we saw that same kind of barbaric activity in 1929 with the massacre in Hebron. But my shock was that it was actually happening in our time, because when I was working on this book from 2019 until its publication in 2024, I really never once imagined that anything like what happened in 1929 with, you know, the brutal slaughter and the rapes and the butchering of people by their neighbors and the killing of children, I didn't think that something like that could happen again in our lifetime. And the fact that it happened, didn't just happen again, but happened on a scale so much larger than 1929. And the fact that so many around the world didn't just justify those atrocities, but celebrated them. You know, on the streets of New York and LA and Chicago, people were celebrating and praising these so-called freedom fighters. And so, you know, I did not set out after October 7th to write a book about the massacre that was a preview of October 7th. I started writing this book back in 2019 to help people understand the true roots of this conflict and the true causes of it, and the dangers of continuing to ignore those roots and that history. But on October 7th, it became hauntingly clear that those lessons of history have been ignored for far too long. And I don't think that the conflict began in 1929. You know, I think that, you know, before 1929, there were already tensions in British Mandate Palestine between the Jewish minority and the Arab majority of the land. But the massacre of 1929 and the riots that took over all of Palestine that week in August, those were the first shots, if you will, of the modern conflict as we know it. And that massacre is ground zero of this conflict, because in that massacre and its causes and its aftermath, you can see everything that we're seeing today explained through the causes of that massacre and its aftermath. And sadly, nothing has been learned.
I want to start with touch on one point in how you're describing the land before the establishment of the State of Israel and referring to it as Palestine. How does the Palestine that you're describing compare to the Palestine that the Palestinian nationalism movement describes it?
That's a great question. So when we hear people shouting Free Palestine or talking about going back to 1948, it's really baffling because in 1948, there was no Free Palestine. There has never been an independent state of Palestine in the history of the name Palestine. Palestine is not even an Arabic word. It was a name given to the land of Judea, the kingdom of Judea and the land of Israel by conquerors, by the rulers of the land in response to a Jewish rebellion in the first century as punishment for the Jews of Judea for rising up, and they named it Palestine after the biblical enemies of the Jewish people, the Philistines. So that's one element of the juxtaposition of, what Palestine was in 1948 versus this imagined Palestine that so many activists talk about. In British Mandate Palestine, the government was the British Empire. The government before the British Empire took control of Palestine after World War I, it was the Ottoman Empire that ruled Palestine for more than 400 years prior to that. And before the Ottomans, you had a whole rotating cast of powers that ruled Palestine, from the Greeks, the Crusaders, the Romans. So in my book, the rulers of Palestine in that time are the British. They control all of the subjects of Palestine who are Jewish and Arab. And as I write in my book, the Jews and Arabs living in the land at the time were all considered Palestinians. So when you said Palestinian before 1948, it didn't mean Arabs in Palestine. It meant Jews and Arabs. So only today do we have this situation where people talk about freeing Palestine and they are really referring to Arab Palestinians. But if you go back to 1948, that would have meant, freeing the land of Palestine from the British.
Do you think that Israel understood the strategic significance of maintaining, I guess, the control of the word Palestine upon the founding of the state? Because I don't think anyone could have imagined that it now would be weaponized in the way that it was. When you're thinking about what you're going to call the realization of the Zionist vision that you'd create a modern political state of Israel, was that even considered about a name or keeping Palestine, I don't know, quote unquote, on the Jewish side as opposed to being this weapon of history now? Did that come across at all in your research?
No, there was never really a debate over what it would be called. It was very obvious that it would be Eretz Yisrael. It was referred to
Israel, right?
Yeah. But it's pretty clear if you read my book that the Jewish leaders of Palestine and then later the Zionist leaders and the leaders of Israel, they thought that there would be a Palestine. In 1947, the plan voted on by the UN and agreed to by the Jewish leaders of Palestine and many other nations other than Arab states. That plan was to have an independent state of Palestine and an independent Arab state alongside an independent Jewish state. And of course, and I think your listeners know how that played out. So, the Arab leaders rejected it, declared jihad, established a holy war, which was later joined. First that holy war was fought by the Palestinian Arabs in 1947. Immediately after that UN vote, the very next day, there were riots in Jerusalem, and the civil war within Palestine between Arabs and Jews began as a result of that declaration of war and that rejection of the UN partition plan. But later, after Israel was established, then all of the surrounding armies, of Iraq and Jordan and Syria all joined that war. And even after Israel was established, Israeli leaders expected that there would be a a two-state solution, maybe they didn't use those words, of course, but they expected that the Palestinian Arabs who had been made refugees by the war their leaders declared would eventually have their own state. And Israeli leaders even continued to believe that after 1967, when Arab states again declared war and tried to win back the land they had lost as a result of their failed war in 1947 and 1948. So I don't think there was ever a question of, taking back that name Palestine, or that it would be used against Israel in such a way as it is today.
Do you think that the leaders of the Zionist movement and the founders of the State of Israel understood August 24th, 1929 in the way that they should have?
I think they did. Before 1929, many of the native Jews of Palestine, in addition to many of the observant Jews who had immigrated to Palestine from Europe, many of them were not Zionists. They didn't consider themselves Zionists. They opposed the secular Zionist movement because they saw it as this secular nationalist contamination of Judaism. They believed that the Jewish masses would only return to Zion, to Zion, with the coming of Mashiach, and they saw this kind of co-opting of that divine ordinance of, the return to Zion by this very irreligious movement. And so before 1929, Zionism wasn't this rallying force, neither within Palestine, Eretz Yisrael, or the Jewish diaspora. Of course, the Jewish diaspora really only came around to Zionism with the Holocaust, but within Palestine, within Eretz Yisrael, within the old Yishuv, 1929 was a turning point, after which not all, but many of those who had opposed it, including Sephardi, Mizrahi Jews, who were very traditional, very religious, very opposed to the very European secular Zionist movement, much of that antagonism melted away after 1929, because they realized that if Jews are going to remain in their homeland, they can't do so under British protection or under the protection of any other foreign power. The British absolutely failed and even betrayed their Jewish subjects in 1929, because there were all the warning signs of an impending massacre. And even as the massacre was unfolding, they turned a blind eye. And then after the massacre, the British sought to pit the blame on Jewish immigration and Jewish land purchases rather than on the British appointed Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, whose incitement led to the riots. So there was an absolute recognition within the Jewish community in Palestine that they would only be safe under the protection of their own army and in their own country. So after 1929, not just the Jewish leaders in Palestine, but Jewish citizens or Jewish residents of Palestine rallied around not just the cause of Zionism, but also Sephardim and Mizrahim, who had until then not joined the Haganah. The Haganah had until 1929 been a very much Ashkenazi secular enterprise. After 1929, you saw many Sephardim and Mizrahim joining the Haganah. The Haganah became a much more centralized and organized fighting force. And then the aftermath of the massacre didn't just lead to the Haganah becoming a stronger and more centralized force, but it also led to the breakaway from the Haganah of more, militant, much more, instead of reactive forces, they didn't. So, okay, I'll just go back. So the Haganah, even after 1929, insisted on being just a reactionary force, so that if riots or attacks broke out, they would defend Jewish communities. But there were many members of the Haganah after 1929 who said that's not enough. We need to preempt these attacks. We need to carry out retaliatory attacks. And so they went on to form Etzel. And so, the the response within the Jewish community in Palestine was very much affected by the massacre, but you can't say the same for the international community or the West or the British. I mean, the British, as I said, responded to the massacre by blaming not just Jewish immigration and land purchases for causing this anger and frustration that led to these barbaric attacks, which, of course, just as it is today, that thinking would never apply to anyone else. I don't think if a massacre had taken place by Brits in England reacting to, immigration by Irish people, they would say, oh yeah, they beheaded and raped these women because they're upset over immigration. Yet that thinking, just as it's applied today to justify barbaric attacks by Arabs, not just in Israel, but around the world, was used back then. This appeasement, this idea that if we just limit Jewish immigration and land sales, all of this will go away. That clearly did not work then, and that thinking, that flawed thinking, continues today. Just as we saw after October 7th. I mean, instead of the world calling for Hamas to surrender, to unconditionally return those innocent hostages to their families and end the war, those calls were directed at Israel to stop fighting this sadistic terrorist organization that had just carried out the worst terrorist attack in modern history. I mean, this is often called, the second worst terrorist attack in modern history because 9/11 is seen as worse. But if you look at it proportionally, October 7th was the equivalent of 40,000 Americans being slaughtered in one day, and hundreds, if not thousands, being taken hostage.
Oftentimes, until your book, really, it's been a certain segment of the population that focuses on the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and what happened on August 24th, 1929. What happened? What did the Arab population do to the Jewish population, and who was Haj Amin al-Husseini, for those who are unfamiliar with the totality of his legacy, if you can call it that?
So Haj Amin al-Husseini was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem for much of the British Mandate of Palestine. So he was appointed in 1921. He, until then, had already been this very radical figure. He had been exiled to Transjordan, where he was hiding out with Bedouin tribes there because he had been accused of inciting a much smaller riot in 1920 in Jerusalem, the Nebi Musa riots. And he was a very anti-Zionist voice in the Arab community. He also came from one of the most powerful and wealthy Arab families in Palestine, the al-Husseini clan. And his father had been the Grand Mufti, his half-brother had been Grand Mufti, but he was not an obvious choice because he was this very extremist figure. And yet it was actually the first High Commissioner of Palestine, Herbert Samuel, who was Jewish and adamant Zionist. He appointed the Grand Mufti to his all-powerful post. The Grand Mufti is basically the equivalent of Chief Rabbi of Palestine. So he was the chief Islamic figure in the land, and as such, he was considered the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule. And Herbert Samuel appointed him to that post because he believed that since he was seen by many Arabs as being, on a certain side, as being Jewish, being a Zionist, so he wanted to win favor of the Arab population by showing that he's not one-sided, he's going to be neutral. And so he appointed the Grand Mufti, and so he appointed Haj Amin al-Husseini to be the Grand Mufti.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
He was openly anti-Jewish, and Herbert Samuel knew that? Or it was one of those things where he was saying one thing within the mosque and he was saying something else on the street?
No, he was openly anti-Zionist. Not Jewish. He used the word, he was against the Zionist goal of establishing a Jewish home in Palestine. and he was adamantly and very xenophobically against Jewish immigration, but he used Jewish immigration as a way to spread fear among the population that rising Jewish immigration was going to drive out the entire Arab population or Muslim population from the land. And also he spread rumors that the Jews of Palestine were planning to conquer Al-Aqsa Mosque. So he began to spread that rumor, which persists today. He began to spread that rumor in 1928. And that rumor was so successful, and that incitement against this supposed Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque and replace it with a third temple managed to convince the Muslim population that the Jewish, not just Jewish immigration, but the Jewish natives of Palestine were their enemy. And the reason he did that was because he had been facing years of accusations of corruption, nepotism, misuse of religious funds. He wasn't just the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, he was also the president of the Supreme Muslim Council. And so he oversaw all religious funds. So the Waqf, the Sharia courts, all Muslim holy sites were under his jurisdiction. And those allegations of corruption and misuse of funds were justified. He was extremely corrupt. And yet, once he began to spread this rumor that the Jews of Palestine were plotting to conquer Al-Aqsa Mosque, much, if not all, of that criticism kind of disappeared, because suddenly there was a much more menacing threat to the Arabs of Palestine than their corrupt leader. And they began to rally around him. And after the massacre and the riots in 1929 that were a direct result of this year-long campaign of propaganda and disinformation and fear-mongering. After the massacre, he became even more powerful and more popular. And with that power, he began not just to silence his critics, and not only critics, but Arab leaders who sought cooperation and sought peaceful coexistence. Those people were often intimidated into silence and to ceasing their cooperation with the Jewish community, or they were assassinated if they refused to. And we see that today with Hamas, of course, and not just Hamas. I mean, Palestinians, moderates and peace-seeking Palestinians, there's a reason we don't hear from them, and there's a reason many people think they do not exist, and that is because they would be killed if they spoke out. And there's also a reason why those who do speak out, mostly on social media, they don't live in the West Bank or Gaza. They live in the US or in the UK, places where, they've had to flee the West Bank and Gaza because they fear they will be killed. Not necessarily just by Hamas, by the way, by sometimes their own families or their community, because this atmosphere of, of fear and of intimidation of those who seek cooperation. They're labeled collaborators. They're accused of normalization with Israel. And that began with the Mufti. So his legacy is, you can't understate what an impact he and the massacre and his entire, his time as being the leader of the Palestinian people, the first leader of the Palestinian people. I mean, when you look up first leader of the Palestinian people, you often find Arafat, but the Mufti actually trained Arafat. Arafat was his cousin. And after the Mufti was forced to flee Palestine, he actually settled in Berlin, and throughout World War II, he lived in a Nazi-financed mansion in Berlin, and he served as the Nazis' chief Arab voice, spreading propaganda on Arabic radio stations throughout the Muslim world. He recruited tens of thousands of Muslims to fight for the Nazis. He led the Arab branch of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. And after World War II, when he was wanted for Nazi war crimes by the UN, he ended up fleeing again. He had fled Palestine for Iraq, and then he ended up in Berlin. After the World War II, he fled again to Cairo, where he met Arafat and began to train him. And Arafat eventually took his throne as the leader of the Palestinian people.
Just want to interject. There's really nothing new under the sun, right? And yesterday on Hamas official channels, they released the following statement, quote, "Hitler said that if he wanted to, he would have killed all the Jews, but he left some alive so that the world would understand what kind of immoral, murderous people they are. Israel violated the ceasefire. Today the Zionists carried out attacks in several places in Gaza, violating the ceasefire agreement." The emphasis being on Hitler. It truly is remarkable that you just have to look back in the history. And it's not some made-up conspiracy theory. It's actual fact. But when we talk about conspiracy theory and, as President-elect Trump says, fake news, it was still a threat back then. And if you could go into what happened on that day of the massacre and also the impact that news had on how people understood what was going on.
Yeah, so on August 24th, 1929, early in the morning, the Jewish residents of Hebron were already cowering in their homes. They had locked the doors and closed all windows because the previous day, riots had already spread from Jerusalem to Hebron, and one yeshiva student had been killed. And following his death, the British police and most of their Arab policemen were patrolling the streets. It had been quiet, but the Jews of Hebron sensed that that quiet was about to be disrupted. And sure enough, on Saturday morning, 3,000 Muslim men marched through the streets of Hebron chanting Allahu Akbar, Itbach al-Yahud, God is great, slaughter the Jews. And their groups of rioters were led often by the Islamic leaders of Hebron. So the Waqf officials in Hebron, the imams, the Muslim teachers were often at the head of these rioters, rallying them forward to every Jewish home in Hebron. And they proceeded to go from house to house and tortured, butchered, raped, castrated. Children watched their parents butchered by their neighbors. Infants were slaughtered in their mother's arms. Just horrific atrocities. There were people who were burnt alive. And the most shocking element of that attack was that many of these victims knew their assailants by name. Until that day, these rioters had been their friends, neighbors, co-workers, landlords. Many of the Jews living in Hebron at the time rented their homes from Arab landlords. Those were the landowners at the time, the Arabs of Palestine. They owned the land, and when Jews purchased the land that they purchased, it was from Arab landowners. And that day, that single day, led to the death of 67 unarmed Jewish men, women, and children in Hebron alone. But the riots, of which the massacre was part, those riots took place over the course of a week and killed 133 Jews throughout Palestine. No community was untouched. The British had to evacuate Jews from Gaza, from villages and towns throughout the land. In Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, they didn't suffer as many casualties because they had defenses. The Haganah was organized and prepared. In fact, the Haganah had come to Hebron 2 days before the massacre and offered to either evacuate the Jewish community to Jerusalem or to remain in Hebron to defend them when the riots erupted there, or to arm them. And the Jewish leaders in Hebron were so adamant that nothing would harm, nothing would come to them, and that these riots wouldn't hit Hebron, because Hebron before 1929 was considered the safest place for Jews in Palestine. It was a place where Jews and Muslims had lived side by side in relative peace for centuries. And this was a place where Jews and Arabs worked together. They were friends. They drank coffee together. They played backgammon together. Jews and Muslims attended each other's weddings and holiday celebrations. And, the Jewish community in Hebron was a very small minority. It was just 800 people living surrounded by 20,000 Muslims, but they felt safe. They thought that their Arab neighbors and friends wouldn't harm them, even if the riots affected the rest of the country. They knew that in 1920 and 1921, when much smaller riots had erupted in Jaffa and in Jerusalem, that even though those riots had spread to other parts of Palestine, they hadn't reached Hebron because of those peaceful relations that existed for so many years between the Jews and Muslims in Hebron. And so the Jewish leaders of Hebron, when the Haganah came 2 days before the massacre, they unanimously told them to leave. They said, your presence here will actually only make things worse. They said, our Arab neighbors are our friends. They'll never hurt us. In fact, they'll protect us. And sure enough, on Saturday morning, the same Arab friends and neighbors who did promise to protect their friends and neighbors either turned a blind eye or took part in the massacre. However, it's really important to note that at least 200, perhaps more than 200 Jews were rescued by their Arab neighbors that day. So more Jews were actually rescued by their Arab neighbors than those who were killed. But, it was 3,000 Muslim men who participated in this massacre out of a population of 20,000 people. So a massive amount of the population participated in this massacre. And it was only 24 Arab families who rescued more than 200 Jews that day, because each of them either took Jews into their homes and hid, 30 people, sometimes more than that, in their own homes, risking their own lives to do so, or they stood guard outside their Jewish friends, neighbors, tenants' homes and made sure that the mobs didn't enter. There was literally a man who arrived on a white horse from his vineyards. His son came running to the vineyards and said, they're butchering the Jews, they're killing the Jews, come help. And his tenant, this Arab landlord, was renting his home to the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Hebron, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Slonim. And in his home, he had not just his five of his children, but also Jews who had taken shelter in his home because they thought that his home would be safe. And thanks to his Arab landlord, he and everyone in his home were saved. This Arab man, who was in his 70s, he stood guard outside Rabbi Slonim's house. His name was Abu Shakr. And he told the mob, you'll have to kill me if you want to get inside this house. And they stabbed him in the leg, but he didn't back down, and they went away. Yet Rabbi Slonim's story is a really good example of the opposite spectrums of humanity that were observed on I was about to say October 7th because it's so similar, but August 24th, 1929, the different sides of humanity that we witness, acts of courage and heroism and empathy and compassion against, the opposite end of humanity of the capacity for hatred and the capacity to believe wild disinformation. His son, Rabbi Slonim's son, Eliezer Dan Slonim, he was also a leader of his community, but not a religious leader. He was a business leader. He was the head of the of the Hebron branch of the Anglo-Palestine Bank, which would eventually become Bank Leumi. And he had many Arab friends from, his business. He was the only Jew on Hebron City Council. And his home was also seen as a refuge. So that morning, there were more than 70 people taking shelter in his home, in addition to him, his wife, and their young children. His friends had offered to protect his home and everyone in it, and they had stood guard outside that morning, but once the mobs arrived, they were gone. And one of his friends was actually inside his home when that mob came in, and he was among those, carrying out these atrocities. And he was told by the mob, just hand over the foreigners among you, and we'll spare you and your family. And he told them, the Jewish people are not like you. We don't have foreigners among us. We're all brothers and sisters. And he was murdered along with his wife, who was raped before she was killed, and their 5-year-old son was slaughtered as well. The mob also tried to kill their 11-month-old baby, but he survived miraculously. He was found by one of the women who had hid beneath dead bodies. When the mob left the home, she looked around to see who could be saved, and she found Eliezer Dan Slonim's 11-month-old son in the arms of his mother, or beside the dead body of his mother, and they managed to save him, Shlomo Slonim. So, on October 7th, if you think about it, it's very similar, because the Jews who were murdered on August 24th, 1929 in Hebron, they were the most peaceful Jews you could imagine. They were religious, traditional, anti-Zionist. These weren't the Jews of the new Yishuv building the foundations of a Jewish state on their backs. They were pious Jews living a quiet existence centered around the Torah. They thought they would be safe. They sought peaceful coexistence. They had lived peaceful coexistence. They didn't need to seek it. And on October 7th, most of the people who were kidnapped or slaughtered were left-leaning, if not left-wing, Israelis who sought peace with Palestinians. Many of them were activists who had campaigned for peace. They were volunteers for Road to Recovery, bringing Palestinians from Gaza to receive treatment in Israeli hospitals. And in the same vein that we saw these courageous Arab neighbors rescue their Jewish neighbors and tenants and friends on August 24th, 1929, we also saw many Arab Israeli citizens. Of course, there were not Palestinian residents of Gaza helping the Jews who were kidnapped and brought to Gaza, but within Israel, Muslim citizens of Israel often played heroic roles on October 7th, whether they were police officers who rescued Jews from the Nova massacre, or whether they were Bedouin people working on the kibbutzim. Some of them were, of course, kidnapped as well. And
hostages that are Muslims.
Yeah. So when you think about this conflict and you look at, okay, Muslim citizens of Israel are, very peaceful, very, humane people. They're nurses and doctors, and, this idea that Islam is to blame, or that all Arabs are, against the Jewish state. It's not Arabs. It's the Palestinian people who are being raised from the time they're children by not just their own leaders to hate Jews and hate Israelis, but by the UN and UNRWA and their schools and their curriculum. It doesn't have to be this way. They don't have to be indoctrinated to become to martyrdom. I've done a lot of research, not just for the book, but in my own reporting as a journalist. Before I started working on this book, I did an investigation for Foreign Policy magazine about UNRWA and its curriculum, which the UN claims to be an education for peace, which is the most laughable statement you can imagine when you look at this curriculum and these textbooks. They literally encourage martyrdom and terrorism. They glorify terrorists. They deny the Jewish history in this land and inculcate children to believe that the Jews are merely occupying settlers who have no right to live here. And if that's what you're teaching children, then of course they're going to grow up to become terrorists. Of course they're going to grow up to want to kill Jews, because if they're taught that this is the way to bring glory to their people, and that is how it's worded in their textbooks, then what do you expect from them? But if you look at Muslim citizens of Israel and Muslim children in Israel, Arab children in Israel, they're not being indoctrinated that way. They're being taught what children should be taught. The Palestinian curriculum, if you look at it, it amounts to child abuse, and it is leading to this. I mean, it's not the only thing leading to this endless cycle of violence, but it's one of many things leading to it, and it really doesn't have to be this way, and it could be so different if world leaders took notice of the true drivers of this conflict and didn't continue to believe that appeasing these organizations and this kind of perspective is going to bring peace. I mean, that's been the mistake since 1929, and it has led us to only more death and destruction. And, by the way, much of that death and destruction is felt by the Palestinian people more than anyone else. So people who think that supporting Hamas and this, endless violent resistance to end Israel, I don't understand, really. I cannot understand how they don't realize that 100 years of violent resistance has only brought more suffering to the Palestinian people and has pushed the creation of a Palestinian state even further into the distance, to the point where it's, if there's any thought by people that October 7th was going to lead to a two-state solution, and many people were talking about that, many smart people, Western leaders were talking about that. I mean, it just shows.
You even had a member of the Biden administration go on 60 Minutes and say, well, if only Israel had used the alleged public support on October 8th, then they could have had two states and there would have been peace. I mean, it's delusional.
Even, somebody as supportive of Israel like Antony Blinken the other day, despite the fact that he said things, that are very, true, is that, he told the New York Times that Hamas should have been called upon to release the hostages. Why hasn't pressure been put on Hamas? But he also said the other day that Israel needs to recognize the need for Palestinian self-determination, and that Israel needs to recognize their need for a state. Israel and everybody but the Palestinians has offered the Palestinians a state. Israel offered the Palestinians a state in 2000, in 2008. The British offered a Palestinian state in 1937 and the UN in 1947. Every time the Palestinians have been offered a state and self-determination, they have rejected those offers. So I think it's really mind-boggling why world leaders haven't recognized that they are enabling the very forces that continue to perpetuate this conflict, which is this idea that the Palestinians are somehow going to destroy Israel and erase Israel from the map, and that they will get this Muslim land that they believe needs to always be Muslim land because it was once Muslim land. And we see that from Hamas, as you said. I mean, the Hamas, when the ceasefire and hostage deal was declared, Hamas's leaders pledged already to carry out more October 7th and to never end their battle for al-Aqsa. Of course, October 7th was called the Al-Aqsa flood, and they are praising it, and not just Hamas, but Palestinians in Gaza are praising October 7th as a honorable day for the Palestinian people, and pledging to continue that battle. And it's just really depressing how many intelligent people refuse to learn the lessons of history. And I really don't understand why.
So I was particularly saddened in many parts of your book, but one in particular was when you went to Hebron to try to find descendants of the Arabs who saved Jews, and you could only find one that was willing to actually speak about it for a variety of different issues, obviously. Mm-hmm. Retribution and what it might do to their name and their family, I'm guessing, correct? So I want to, we could debate how we got to this situation and what led to October 7th and political considerations and Oslo and all of these things, but I'm interested in tackling the issue of extremism with you now, because the last portion of your book talks about that. Do you consider the idea that modern day Palestinian nationalism is incompatible with the modern day state of Israel, and therefore we have to act as landowners in the land of Israel and simply do what we need to do as the state of Israel has to do what the state of Israel has to do, and it's the Jewish state, we're just going to do it? Do you find that to be an extreme position? Because oftentimes when people invoke Bezalel Smotrich or Itamar Ben-Gvir, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and he liked Rabbi Kahana, so therefore it's an extremist, and this is outside of the polite conversation. Let's put it that way, right? Is that an extreme position to say that Palestinian nationalism is incompatible with the state of Israel here in 2025?
I don't think that's an extreme statement, but I think many of the other things that they believe and say and do are not only extreme, but dangerous to the Jewish state and its future and its people. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. I mean, even, leaders of Shas and United Torah, not left-wing people by any means, also believe that.
Well, okay, I'm going to say, let's take the politics, let's take the political parties out of it, right? Because unfortunately in Israel and the Knesset, you can say there's a variety of interests, right? So for the same way that Shas might be right-wing, but at the same time they're trying to prevent their children from going to the army, so that the Dati Leumi, the religious Zionist community, has to do all of the heavy lifting when it comes to the army. So let's take the parties out of it for a second. I'm talking just in terms of the Palestinian nationalism and its obsessiveness with murdering Jews and removing Zionists from Palestine, not the Palestine that you're describing of pre-state British Mandate Palestine, but what they're saying is the full land, everything that you would see in the map of Israel is Palestine, and the idea that there's no making peace with this murderous ideology, and confronting that essential truth. Because, when we look at, we're recording this on January 17th, and there's just a deal that was signed, and we're releasing people that are murderers, that are going to be heroes in the street. It's not saying, oh, I don't want this person in our neighborhood because, just like a sex offender, we don't want them around our kids. This is, oh, this guy maybe killed the Fogel family, so let's go bring him around and parade him as a hero. So how people have a legitimate concern, which I think is only confirmed by your book. But I think that it's somehow outside of the realm of normal conversation. I don't know why, though.
Yeah. So, first of all, let me be clear that I wish this ceasefire deal had not been necessary. I wish that the international community had done its job and called for Hamas on October 8th to lay down its weapons, turn over the innocent hostages, and that the calls and the recognition that we did have on October 8th that, Gaza cannot be ruled by Hamas and needs, different leadership. I think that could have created a different reality, and I do think that there was a missed opportunity there. Obviously, the PA is not a perfect entity. However, not only is the PA assisting Israel in many security aspects in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, but also what was called for after October 7th wasn't the PA as it is now ruling Gaza. It was a rehabilitated PA, because the PA is recognized as a failed, as a very broken institution.
And they fund terrorism.
Exactly. Yes. But the reason Hamas is still in place right now, the reason Hamas is still alive isn't because Israel hasn't dropped enough bombs on Gaza, isn't because Israel hasn't killed enough Hamas militants. It's because so long as there's not a different entity ruling Gaza, and I do not believe that entity should be Israel. I think if Israel goes back into Gaza, there will just be more, there'll just be terror attacks all the time. Especially after this war, there are plenty of people who want to take revenge on the deaths of their brothers, sisters, mothers, children. Understandably so. I think if we had our families killed, we would also want to take revenge. I mean, maybe not me, but I think many people would want to take revenge. And I think that's pretty expected. So I don't agree with Bezalel Smotrich or Ben-Gvir or any of the people who believe that settling Gaza is the answer October 7th. I think that's really just kind of very blind way to see it, because settling Gaza will.
I want to push back, and I want to be very clear. If anyone were to take a cut of this video and say, "Oh, this is my position," I'm not advocating this as my position, Daniel Mael. This is not my position. I'm only going to push this idea forward to try to kind of have an actual intellectual discussion about it. So this is not my position. I'm just saying. But what would you say about? But what would you say to the argument, though, that by letting them, by letting the existing infrastructure kind of rebuild, even under a revised Palestinian Authority or a re-envisioned Palestinian Authority, that they're still going to nurture this idea of hatred, and they're still going to teach people to kill to become a shaheed, that unless we actually control it from a security perspective, there's no way to ensure that we're actually going to be safe. And you're saying it might increase terrorist attacks, but I think they would say they're going to try to kill us anyway. So why not just be as safe as possible as opposed to leaving the door open?
The thing is that was possible. That was the plan that Israel could have agreed to after October 7th, which is creating a different regime that would be peaceful. And I think right now, I think that was hard to see then, but I think if you look at it now, Hamas is still there because they not only don't have an opposition challenging them in Gaza, which they could have by now, because the PA is not Hamas and the PA is the rival of Hamas. They are more moderate. Obviously they're not, these pro-Israel, expecting it to be exactly what Israel wants is just, I think, really unrealistic. At the end of the day, they do want a Palestinian state, and that doesn't mean that they need to indoctrinate their children, and that's what I think that the U.S. had in mind, that it would be this different form of the PA. It would have the involvement of the U.S. and other parties that Israel would be involved with to make sure that Hamas didn't re-arise, and that the kinds of leadership that allowed it to happen wouldn't take hold there. But also, October 7th was also the result of failures of our own leadership, of the Israeli leadership, and failures of the security establishment. This could have been prevented if so many warnings had not been ignored. And I think the fact that the hostages were the ones who, and not just the hostages, but their families and all their loved ones, the fact that they're paying the price for the mistakes of elected officials and security officials whose mistakes led to their horrific abduction and their horrific slaughter of their families, those people shouldn't be paying the price. It should be the politicians who enabled this catastrophe and their mistakes. And I think the fact that they are still in power and that there has not been a reckoning of our own leadership and that there still has not been an investigation, I think that is horrible. And I think that
I'll go as far as to say that the IDF has been outright disrespectful to the families of the fallen from Nahal Oz and from others who are trying to see the tapes. Their children are already dead, and they're asking for tapes. They're being gaslit. They don't have answers. I speak to many of these people on a daily basis, and as I told you before we started recording, I'm a 15 out of 10, scale of 1 to 10. I'm a 15, maybe 150. Angry on their behalf. It's outright disrespectful. And the fact that many of these people have gotten promotions, even though they ignored many of the warnings, as from one parent to another, you can't even imagine what it feels like to see that if God forbid, something like that happened to your child. It's unbelievable. And the fact that they are dismissed in such a way is really just so frustrating to see. And it's really hard to watch.
And the fact that the Tatzpataniot, who were the ones who warned their supervisors of what they were seeing in Gaza, that they are the ones being held hostage and tortured and who knows what they have suffered, that they're still there. And what's really what's really depressing is that the agreement that is going into place now could have been agreed to long ago. This was never going to be an easy agreement. There was never going to be, unless the international community had done its job in placing more pressure on Hamas, the only way to get our hostages out of there was going to be this painful, costly negotiation process with Hamas. And yes, murderers are going to be set free, but I am fully confident that Israel is capable of killing those people after they are out, even if they don't carry out some kind of terror attack. But if a terrorist is getting out, and Israel's capable of a lot of things. And I think that just to get those hostages, women and men and children and elderly, out of Gaza, at whatever price, I think Israel should have made that decision long ago. I know that's not a popular opinion, but I think that as a mother, I think, I just think that I think that also the way the police has treated the protesting mothers and loved ones of hostages has been a stain on the Israeli police and its leader, Ben Gvir, because if you see the way that these hostage families are treated at their protests, thrown to the ground and dealt with force, after what they've been through and what they're suffering, and not after, I mean while they are suffering, and just calling for an agreement to bring their children home, and an agreement that is now going into place, that could have been in place long ago before hostages were murdered. And I think that Smotrich's statement that this deal shouldn't go into place because we need total victory and a return of all our hostages, I think that those are completely contradictory statements. The return of all our hostages is only possible with an agreement. We've seen that the military pressure has only killed hostages. Of course, we've also managed to rescue hostages, which is incredible. But I mean, even, soldiers and the IDF says, that's not going to be possible for most of the hostages, especially after Hamas put into place its new tech strategy, where if they hear soldiers coming to save hostages, they're directed to kill the hostages under their guard. I mean, this is a satanic organization we are dealing with. And I think that the belief that more military force and a quest for total victory is going to free the hostages is really just delusional, if not dishonest. I really question if he even believes what he's saying.
Okay, I'll say this. I think that the best defense of that position, again, I'm offering this as someone who can hear from multiple people, but my focus is on equipment and making sure that they have the best possible chance of doing that and coming home safely. Let's put it this way. If the Army had all of the proper equipment and hadn't been sleeping for decades, and they had everything in place to successfully carry out the missions as required, and this goes back to October 7th itself, in terms of triangulating cell phone positions and actually having all of that technology in place when the hostages were taken, and not having to call startup companies in Tel Aviv to ask them to help locate where the hostages might be. And the stories are endless. I'll say this. If they actually had been in place and they actually had a real strategy that they had considered before all of this happened, saying, God forbid there's a hostage taken into Gaza, how are we attacking the Gaza Strip and how are we going about it? And not coming up with things on the fly, as was the case after the weeks following October 7th. I do, and you see the same themes come up and again throughout the military campaign. I think that there is a different way that could have happened, in which the military pressure is brought in a way that is different than how we saw and delivers different results. Meaning, if they actually applied full force and didn't go into Beit Hanun and then leave Beit Hanun, and then go to Sajaya and leave Sajaya, and go back to Sajaya and leave Sajaya, and stay and actually say, we are putting our foots around the neck and we're going to go full in and demand this, I do think that's their case for having the quote-unquote total victory and saying we're pushing and eliminating Hamas. That's what it is. So it's a little bit, I think it's more sophisticated than just, we just have a deal or we don't have a deal. It's the military pressure that people are talking about and pushing for is not what we saw.
The thing is, Hamas has managed to recruit as many fighters as it has lost. So
okay, that's according to Blinken, and I'd say that they're people that are hungry. They're people that want food because they've hijacked the aid, which goes back to the international community. That they're saying, "Will you go run around with an AK-47 and I'll give you 10 sandwiches or something along those lines?" Okay, then you're a member of Hamas. You know, it's not the same as training.
But I'm just saying there's always going to be, by that thinking of eliminating Hamas, there's always going to be a new militant that the IDF is going to, it's just how much longer can our soldiers stay there and just try to kill every last Hamas militant when there's always going to be a new one. It's just not sustainable.
Let's put it this way. Think about the family of Oron Shul and Hadar Golden. The fact that they're not on this first deal, the first stage, and that they're kind of held as the grand prize of hostages that Hamas has taken, and Israel essentially abandoned them for 9 years before October 7th. And to me, every time I see the Maskin tape that has become very famous, I'm wondering why it's not the 3,821 and why it's only the one that's dealing with October 7th, because these families, the same agony, although it's a slightly different category that we know that they unfortunately fell, but it's that agony. I don't think that Hamas will ever let every hostage out, even in this deal. So we're in this, we talk about a cycle of violence. I'm talking about a cycle of hostage taking. And I think that Israel is going to have to reset how they consider their conduct, but it's obviously no easy answers. But would you understand how, if someone reads your book and sees how this is nothing new under the sun, how they would come out and potentially support a Meir Kahane type?
I mean, I don't think they would need to read my book to support that. I think many of the people who just know anything about the massacre of 1929 think that. But what I try to get through in my book is that it didn't have to be this way, that there were moderates and there continue to be moderates who need to be empowered, and that this reality in which their voices are not heard because they fear for their lives, that reality needs to change if we are going to see an end to this endless war against us. I think Israel needs a Palestinian state more than the Palestinians do, because so long as they are indoctrinated to believe that their state is being, held up by us, then they're going to continue to be able to find ways to launch endless wars against us. But if there is an international effort, not just by Israel, but the U.S., Western leaders, to empower moderate voices and to put an end to this indoctrination in their education system. And I'm talking about, this isn't something overnight. This needs to be done through years of painstaking efforts at not just empowering individuals who can be their future leaders of the Palestinian people who want to see coexistence, people who want to see a peaceful Palestinian state alongside Israel. Those people exist, but
what's the percentage chance? Like, do you think there's a single Palestinian leader who could get up, shake?
Not right now. Zero. No, right now, zero chance. Zero chance. What needs to be done?
If a leader stood up and shook hands with Benjamin Netanyahu and said, "Thank you for agreeing to give us Judea and Samaria, or parts of it, and parts of Gaza," that leader would be assassinated.
Now, absolutely. But I'm talking about creating the groundwork to the point where he wouldn't be assassinated, to the point where a new generation of Palestinians, when you talk to Palestinians individually, they say all they want is to just live a normal life like you and me. They just want to make good money. They want to provide for their families. Many of them will tell you they'd prefer to live in Israel so they can do that. But because they are taught that saying that is treacherous, that makes them a traitor, they won't say that out loud, and they won't say that in groups. But if you create a situation where those individuals don't need to fear and don't need to, hide, and that can be, just an accepted way of thinking, which it should be, then I think we'll have a totally different reality. But, what needs to happen is UNRWA needs to either be shut down or be replaced with an organization that actually educates towards peace. The Palestinian education system needs an overhaul. Their official TV needs an overhaul. Their terrorism funding needs to be eradicated. The Martyrs Fund needs to be replaced with a normal welfare fund that just helps people in need, not people who have carried out terror attacks. And I think world leaders and anyone who seeks peace needs to put in vast amounts of resources into gathering these individuals who could be the future leaders of the Palestinian people, into forming political parties, into, gathering people together so that they don't need to fear for their lives, and creating the atmosphere where peace is possible, because right now it's absolutely not possible. And not only would, even if this leader wasn't assassinated after agreeing to peace with Israel, it wouldn't matter, because the second that state is formed, it would be taken over by the much more powerful forces of, death and destruction and jihad that are so much more powerful than those voices. And I think that it's not going to be an easy road, but I just feel like there is no other hope for an end to this never-ending war if Israel is going to forever control a people who do not want to be controlled, and who, the longer they are controlled, the more violent they can become. And I just think, even just from a standpoint of Israel being a Jewish state and a democratic state, it's not possible. If Israel was to annex the West Bank, the number of Palestinians or Arabs who would be living under Israeli control, if they were to be given the right to vote, they would then be the majority, and the Israeli government would be mostly probably Palestinian government. And those who don't want that to happen and say, okay, then they just won't have the right to vote, that is apartheid. If we're saying that the accusations of Israel being an apartheid state are wrong, which they are, they would no longer be wrong if Israel was to annex the West Bank and refuse to grant voting rights to non-Jewish citizens. That would be apartheid.
I'll say this. One thing that's very confusing to me when we're talking about, obviously, the economic considerations and people wanting to make money and just make a living, it never made sense to me why the current economic situation, when it came to Palestinian communities in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, why the economy was tied into Israel, because so much we're talking about this checkpoint, that checkpoint, and you write about a lot of this experience in your book. And from my perspective as simple person, is just saying, why is the economic situation such that they can't create industry and work within their own space? Like, if you want to turn Shechem into a terrorist hellhole, I guess go do that. But why do you then get to come into Israel if you're thinking about it as a separate place? I cannot understand.
Totally. You're absolutely right.
I'm sitting here saying that, okay, maybe less expensive labor but in 2025, you have the internet. You can go and get a degree. A lot of these terrorists are getting degrees in jail. You can get a degree, not in jail, get a degree in Jenin, do whatever you want to do, and preach about killing people, fine, but just don't come in. And then the economic argument to me is also just, it's hard. It's like if someone's sitting in at home and not actively moving toward something, it's just hard to see how it's progressing. And I fundamentally don't understand why it's set up like this. And it creates these encounters that are problematic and are, I would be pissed too if I sat there for an hour every day going back and forth trying to go to my job. But at the same time, if you look at it honestly, it's completely necessary to make sure that there's not someone coming in to blow themselves up.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, it's two things. One, I think it is completely mind-boggling how people don't see that these security measures, I mean, Israelis understand, but I think that people in the international community just look at these measures and say, oh, they're awful and they're oppressive. Like, well, why do you think that those measures exist? Do you think Israel just wanted to make people's lives miserable by making them wait in checkpoints? No, it's because of the decades of suicide bombings and car rammings and shooting attacks and stabbing attacks that have made Israel have to take those measures. Of course it has to take those measures. And that's another, way that the international community and the international media has failed, because we don't see those stories of those attacks in the mainstream media, only in the Jewish media or the Israeli media. The thing you mentioned about Hamas praising Hitler, I didn't see that anywhere. So there's this idea that only Israel is taking these measures and making Palestinian lives miserable for no reason, because the reasons aren't covered in news outlets. So people don't see the reasons why those measures are necessary. So that's one thing. And then the other point you mentioned about how there is no suitable, sustainable economy in many of these Palestinian cities, particularly, Gaza before October 7th or anywhere in the West Bank. That is another way that the international community has failed, because it has pumped billions of dollars into the Palestinian Authority and, maybe not the West into Hamas, but, other Arab countries have given money to Hamas. And instead of using that money to improve the lives of their people or to create, sustainable economies that can employ their people and prevent the draw of terrorism from being so appealing, because there's no better alternative if they pay them better than they can make in a job. So the international community has been giving this money to these corrupt entities that don't actually use it to improve the lives of the Palestinian people and end this state of poverty that they have been in for decades. And that could have been avoided. Conditions could have been placed on that aid that it has to go towards those programs, employment programs or infrastructure or, schools that don't indoctrinate towards martyrdom and terrorism, that actually teach kids how to live in a world of the 21st century. So, it can't be overstated the important, vital role the international community plays in perpetuating this endless cycle of violence, and the media as well.
Well, yeah. So now I'll offer my opinion on this specific thing. You can quote me on this. Early on in the war, you'd see all these people come on and say, "I hate Bibi Netanyahu, I hate Benny Gantz, I hate Smotrich, I hate Ben Gvir, I hate Lapid," and they're going on and saying it's this person's fault, that person's fault, and you're having debate within Israel as a society with many ideas, and the media reflects that as well. So in the conversations with politicians also do. So you could talk to a U.S. senator, and he could have 3 different Israeli delegations in his office, his or her office that day, and one person could tell you Netanyahu is a criminal. The next person could tell you Netanyahu is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And the third person could say, I don't love him, but he's what we have for the war. Israeli delegations can meet with different people, and you're going to get vastly different answers because it's a democracy. Whereas you look at Al Jazeera and the Arab news, and it's genocide, famine, hunger, bombs. So the way in which things are communicated is also very, very different. And it's our it's, and I'm not saying that we have to suppress the press in Israel or ideas in Israel. In fact, I think we do that actually too much in the media. So we're actually have different visions of what the media is for, and that's how the problems continue to increase. So I guess my fear is that the train has left the station, and I don't see how to reverse it, especially when you have really insanely powerful forces like Al Jazeera and other outlets that are basically making music videos out of what's going on in Gaza and other aspects, and it's strictly focused on demonizing Israel, and it's really hard to undo that, especially with the power they have, because we can't just dismiss it and say, oh, this is on some crazy YouTube channel that nobody sees. You're getting 50, 60 million views. There's this one guy, I remember sending it, I actually sent it to one of the spokespeople from Israel, because there was a debate, the videos that Israel will never in a million years release or let anyone see out of respect for the families. And because we value their dignity. And in Gaza, they're literally cutting reels with bodies. And it's and that's not to say, of course you feel terribly about that situation, but they're using it in a way that's trying to galvanize public opinion. And obviously, it's, you're not having deep intellectual conversations on an Instagram reel of 13 seconds. But when you see someone in an area with 7 body bags and they're holding it is
showing it to the camera like a trophy.
It's compelling. It's compelling footage, and I don't know how you reverse that. So I hear what you're saying about creating alternatives. I'll say this. In our working with soldiers and talking to them, the stuff that, like Mein Kampf in Arabic, I had a family member went into a classroom for elementary school girls, and there was a picture of Osama bin Laden on the wall, and there was a picture of the Twin Towers burning. I don't know how you I don't know how you reverse that, and I share the desire to see that result of creating.
It's the only way that we will see a different.
I just don't see. I think that Palestinian nationalism has evolved from. And please correct me if you think I'm wrong in the historical aspect of this, and we can disagree on the conclusion as well if you want as well. But I think that Palestinian nationalism has evolved. If there ever was a time where it was saying that they want to live side by side with Jews authentically, okay, to now being that it's essentially a death cult from the top, and you've had so many millions at this point of people that have been taught this insane radicalism that's just incompatible with making a peace agreement. I don't know. I
agree.
How. Because even Oslo, right? That was, 30 years ago? It's a different time. Like, you didn't have, the systems didn't work for the last 30 years prior in the way that they just worked. So now you have doubly the number of years, basically, where you've had people just taught that you are a victim. You are a victim. The Zionists are victimizing you. You need to respond, and the best thing you could be is a shaheed. I don't know how you reverse that education for however
what you do is you don't just give up and say this is what we're dealing with and this is it, because I think that kind of thinking led to the tragic mistake that Netanyahu made in allowing Qatar, the country behind Al Jazeera, to give millions of dollars to Hamas. Didn't just allow them to, asked them to.
Yeah.
I mean, that is mind-boggling. Instead, work with a country like the UAE, partners who we know are our friends now, to replace that damaging influence. There's going to be, the only way to change it is to replace it with something else. It's killing them is not going to, do you know what I mean? Like, I just don't think that the solution is a military solution, because it's our future. It's our children who are going to continue fighting this war. And I have Israeli children. I don't want them to continue to need to fight this war. And I don't want to see more soldiers die just so we can continue to have the same kind of enemy. Like, I think that we have seen that peace is possible with other countries that were once our staunchest foes. I mean, before the peace treaty with Egypt, many Israelis thought that kind of peace would be impossible. Same thing with Jordan. I mean, these were countries that invaded Israel and wanted Israel's destruction in 1948, in 1967, and afterwards. And yes, Sadat was assassinated for signing that peace treaty, but it has held. And, it's not a perfect treaty, but it's better than never-ending war, I think. And I think that many soldiers.
I don't think that's a fair juxtaposition. Meaning, I don't think anybody's saying they want never-ending war. I think that. I mean, one could reason.
They don't want never-ending war, but that's what will be the result of not reaching a peace agreement.
I think that you can. I would actually never put it this way. If even the agreement with Egypt was a true peace agreement, we wouldn't be finding tunnels and tunnels and tunnels coming to and from Gaza, and essentially the only way that they've received all of this genocidal material is through those routes. So
that's why I said it's not a perfect peace treaty.
I would say
that it's better. It's not a perfect peace treaty, but I also think that Israel, like, with all due respect to our army, I think the IDF and the Israeli security establishment is more than capable. And I think that one of the things that needs to be investigated when an investigation is open into the failures of October 7th, one of those things that should be investigated is how Israel allowed those tunnels. I mean, not how Egypt. I mean, yes, like, how did Israel not know? Why did we not know about those tunnels between Egypt and Gaza? And if we did, why didn't we put pressure on Egypt, our peace partner? This is part of our peace treaty. Like, the U.S. could have put pressure on Egypt that would have convinced Egypt to shut down those tunnels, to stop taking bribes, to look the other way.
It was crazy. I actually, there's a video on YouTube from Vice. I'll link it in the show notes. There's a journalist who went in a Hamas tunnel in, I think it was 2021, and it was right after the IDF spokespeople said, "Oh, we've destroyed the terror infrastructure." And Hamas brings this journalist into the tunnel, and she says, "Oh, they said they destroyed all the underground infrastructure." He goes, "They're lying. Don't believe anything they say. We're here in the tunnel. Look at this. Look at this brand new, fresh concrete. Everything's great. We have a fan. We have electricity." And she takes a tour. It's really mind-boggling. And
in the same sense that the IDF denied for years that Hezbollah was tunneling. There were residents of northern Israel complaining for years that they heard digging. And the IDF continued to say, no, there's no tunnels. Hezbollah's not digging tunnels into Israel. And they were. And I just don't understand why this information is being not just hidden, but why isn't more being done to destroy these tunnels, it just doesn't make sense that those tunnels between Egypt and Gaza were only discovered now. That's not, I don't believe that.
And you and I have both had this, I would assume, this problem. And actually, the first time I ever came across your work, funny enough, was I was working on I was trying to counter some of the woke insanity about Gaza in the war, and I was looking up abortion rights in Gaza, and I came across your article that you'd written about that. Funny enough, and of course, there's no way to get like states. There's not a freedom of reproductive rights in Gaza. So it's always funny to me when people. I think the first week.
Abortion is illegal in Gaza. Homosexuality is illegal in Gaza. It's just...
The first week of the war, it said reproductive rights are Palestinian rights. So I remember looking up, and I actually came across your article, and it was funny. But you're talking about the IDF in Israel. What was your relationship like with the military as you're trying to report out your book and report from Israel over the last 10 years?
Great. I never had to deal with the Israeli censor. I feel very lucky. I'm not sure, I guess because I was reporting for foreign publications, I didn't have to. I was a foreign, considered a foreign correspondent, even though I'm a dual Israeli U.S. citizen because I made Aliyah. But I was always writing for American publications. And I did stories about the tunnels where I, was with soldiers, with the army, and they were wonderful, really helpful. I always found the IDF spokespeople, as helpful as they could be. They often couldn't say, tell me certain things or, to give no comment. Yeah. But, I never had a bad experience. The only time I had a negative experience was when I was working on this book and I was reporting from Hebron. And, during my reporting in Hebron, I went on the Palestinian side, the Israeli side. As many of your listeners might know, Hebron is divided between 20%, just 20% of Hebron is controlled by Israel and 80% is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And when I was reporting on the Israeli side, where the majority of the residents are actually Palestinians, they are not Israeli citizens, they're not Arab Israelis, they're, Palestinians with, Palestinian license plates, but they live on the same street as Israeli citizens. And it was really interesting to learn about, the differences between the Israeli residents on the Israeli side of Hebron and Palestinian residents. And one of those differences I discovered when I went to interview the only Palestinian descendant of an Arab family who rescued their Jewish neighbors in 1929. This one man, like you mentioned earlier, who was the only one who would speak on the record with me and willing to, use his name in my book. He was this sweetheart, this sweet, sweet man, in his 60s or 50s, I can't remember, but his whole family, generations before him had lived in Hebron, and they had this same very old stone house, and it's literally across the street from where Baruch Marzel lives. And I had already interviewed Baruch Marzel, Tzipi Schlissel, other Jewish residents of Hebron for my book. And anytime I came to interview them, I just got out of my car, walked to their house, said hi to the soldiers there. They asked me, what, I'm there. I said, I'm going to interview Baruch Marzel, or I'm going to interview Tzipi Schlissel, and have a good day. But when I came to interview this man, Taisir Abu Aisha, whose house is known by soldiers in Hebron as the cage house because it's completely covered in iron bars that he put there to protect from stones being thrown at his home by young maybe not even by Israelis who live there. Sometimes it's by Israelis who come for Shabbat Chayei Sarah, when Hebron suddenly becomes a Jewish community of 800 to a city of 30,000 Israelis coming to stay for the Parsha. And, I came to interview him, and I'm walking up to his house, and right outside his house, there's a soldier station there. And he asked me what I'm doing there. I said, I'm here to speak with Taisir Abu Aisha. And I was with a Palestinian translator and an Arabic translator. And he says, did you get approval from the army? I said, approval from the army? I've been here so many, I've come here many times to interview people here. And he said, you've never gotten permission? I said, I guess the people I was coming to interview were Israeli. He said, well, when you're coming to interview a Palestinian, you need to get previous approval from the IDF, and your name has to be on a list. It's true.
No,
it's true.
No. Your story is true. I'm saying, how would they possibly require a permission to speak to a private citizen in their house?
So apparently the rule is, and I don't know why he didn't tell us this. I guess he forgot, the guy who I was coming to interview, or maybe he told my translator and my translator missed it somehow, because my translator is also from Hebron, but he's from the Palestinian side of Hebron. So he didn't know these rules. Palestinians who live in H2, Israel's side of Hebron, any visitor they have needs to be have prior approval for security reasons with the IDF to prevent, So in the end, I called the IDF spokesperson And they said, okay, even though you didn't get previous approval, we know you can go in and interview him, but your Palestinian translator cannot. He can't go into his house. So it was really strange. It's like, and then they said, you can do your interview outside, which kind of made no sense, because it's like, what is he going to do wrong in the guy's house that he couldn't do outside on the street where Jewish residents also live? Like, if this was really about security, like, this Palestinian translator, who is also a sweetheart, he's a friend, he is like the furthest thing from dangerous you can imagine. If he's going to be a threat to security, isn't he going to be more of a threat to security if we're standing outside on the street than if we're in this guy's house? But in the end, we ended up doing the interview because I needed the translator. The Taisir doesn't speak Hebrew or English. I needed my friend, my translator. So we ended up doing the interview on the street, on a curb, in the middle of Ramadan, when Taisir has been fasting all day. It's 85 degrees outside, and we're sitting there for like 4 hours, and this was just kind of a very small snapshot of what life is like for Palestinians in Hebron, for me to see kind of the influence of these, security measures on people who aren't a danger to security. And I'm not saying that this is, Israel's fault. I mean, I think it's the fault of the terror campaign, the relentless campaign of terror that has led to these security measures. I mean, the idea of needing permission from non-residents of Hebron to visit these people, I think it makes sense from a security standpoint. The way it was carried out with me and my translator did not make sense, because my translator was, he's a translator. He, if he's going to be allowed to stand on that street, why shouldn't he be allowed to go into Taisir's house?
I guess the best defense perhaps would be that they want to have cameras on everyone in case they're smuggling something. Obviously, your friend, the translator, is a nice person. Perhaps that the people there are living with the scars of 1929, and
absolutely
nice to them 1 second ago, they're nervous that it's going to happen again.
Absolutely. And not just the scars of 1929, but the ongoing reverberations of 1929. I remember the night before that interview, I was nervous. I was never really nervous coming to Hebron when I was doing my reporting, I guess because before working on this book, I had done reporting in the West Bank and in Palestinian villages where I was told not to speak Hebrew. I was very used to reporting in Palestinian areas. But the night before that interview with Taisir was a horrific attack by a ISIS supporter in Beersheba, where I was living at the time. And you probably remember this. This guy stabbed a woman at a gas station in Beersheba. She was filling up her car with gas, and she was stabbed to death. And this guy carried out a car ramming attack as well. I think his attack killed 4 people in Beersheba that day, and I was coming from Beersheba the next morning to interview them, and so I could understand, the traumatic impact of these attacks in kind of leading to these security measures that, nobody wants these security measures to be necessary. Israeli soldiers don't want to have to be doing this, but it's really, Israel has been given no choice but to have to.
I hope for better days. God willing, there's good news coming out on Monday.
Sunday.
I think Sunday or Monday, when the hostages, at least some of them, are released. Thoughts are with the families who have buried their loved ones during this war and from October 7th, and are dealing with real, authentic pain about the deal, and even authentic pain on a daily basis. And also thoughts and prayers to those who are going to see their parents or their sister or their brother or their cousin's murderer go out. That's not an easy circumstance, and it's part of the unfortunate Israeli reality. And I hope that, God willing, I hope that you're correct. I hope that you are correct, and that there's a way to fix some of these systemic issues. But either way, I encourage everyone who's tuned in and made it this far to check out Ghosts of a Holy War by Yardena Schwartz, and then we can see where you fall out on current events. But Yardena, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Dan. It was really a pleasure, and I agree with your and just echo your thoughts and heartfelt words for the families and people who have lost so much this past 15 months. And yeah, may we see better days.